We can replace your lungs, we can replace your kidneys, people live with dialysis. As we're sort of fixing all this stuff, like, we haven't figured out how to conquer the mind.
Dr. K is a Harvard-trained doctor, real-life monk, and massive Twitch streamer who has helped millions of people improve their own mental health. We talk about the mental health epidemic in the West, how to detect and resolve your emotional issues, and his perspective on the ultimate meaning of life.
You wake up one day and you have nothing left to chase, and you are unhappy. The true spirituality starts with...
One of the things that I've been most curious about, by the way, I have to say, I deeply appreciated our first conversation.
Me too, dude. I loved it.
If you're out there and you're watching this and you haven't seen it, if you want to learn more about me and some Ayurveda that we got to talk about, check that out. But I didn't know as much about your background. I'd seen some of your videos, and it was only through that I was like, wait a second, this guy's a doctor and he's talking about Ayurveda. He seems like well-versed in meditation. Can you tell me a little bit, and the people who might not have heard of you, what I think is most fascinating is that East-West mix that you embody that comes through in your work. So let's start there.
Yeah. So I was growing up, I played a bunch of video games, was sort of addicted to video games, basically failed out of college, and then went to India to find myself. Mm-hmm. So at the age of 21, spent one summer outside of Bangalore at an ashram studying like meditation and yoga, and really just completely fell in love with it. I'd been going through life and like learning things about the external world, like, okay, this is math and this is like history and this is Spanish. But I was always incredibly frustrated because like I could not do the things that I wanted to do. Like I couldn't get my mind to focus. I couldn't wake up on time. I couldn't exercise. Like I had all these goals, but it was like I was just not in control of my body and mind. So what I loved about India is like learning a system that teaches you essentially self-control. Mm-hmm. And understanding how your body and mind works. And I think that then I spent 7 years studying to become a monk. Wow. And during that time, studied all kinds of different stuff. So didn't really find one particular guru or tradition that I was ready to like devote myself to. So I studied at ashrams in India, a little bit in South Korea and Japan as well, and just really like wandered all over the place.
Wow. So you went from video game addicted to this.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And that was the thing is I remember being like a freshman in college. And
what was the game you were addicted to, by the way? Or was it a genre?
So I played a ton of Diablo 2 and a ton of Warcraft 3. So like I wanted to be one of the best Warcraft 3 players like in the world when I was a freshman in college, which is a terrible idea.
Okay. Then those games they don't end easily. So I can see how getting sucked into them, it doesn't stop.
Absolutely.
I was addicted. I wouldn't have called it that time to StarCraft 2. I mean, I remember I was up at 4 a.m. playing one game, and I'm a kid, and the only way that I stopped is after just the self-loathing that I felt, I had to eject the game and snap it in half. And then I woke up in the morning, immediately regretted it. What have I done?
Yeah, it's hilarious, actually. One of my good friends from residency, who's now CEO of Cerebral, told me the same exact story. So him and his brother were playing too much StarCraft, and they made a pact, and they snapped their StarCraft CD. And now he's like CEO of one of the biggest mental health startups.
It was one of the only ways that I was going to stop at that point in time, given the development of my brain and the options available to me.
Yeah.
But continue, please.
Yeah. So just wandered around India and started studying like medicine because like Eastern medicine, because I think that there was just a lot of information there about how human beings work. Decided not to become a monk, met my wife, fell in love, all that good stuff. And then decided to go to medical school. So I did neuroscience research for a couple of years at Harvard, went to medical school, and then trained to become a psychiatrist, and then was on faculty at HMS for 6 years.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned in the conversation that we had that you have done sort of research into the efficacy of Eastern techniques.
Yeah, so like this whole healthy gamer thing was like not what my plan was. So I was like really geared towards evidence-based complementary and alternative medicine. Mm-hmm. So if you look at like Eastern systems of medicine, there isn't a whole lot of like evidence base for them yet. So people will say they are not scientific, but I think that's actually like somewhat of a ignorant statement. Mm-hmm. So they have very, very robust systems that have just not been studied. So that doesn't mean that they're not scientific. It just means we haven't had time to do the studies. Mm-hmm. And so if we sort of think about it, like meditation, for example, has been effective for thousands of years. We started doing research on meditation in like the 60s. And so there's a lot of stuff that So what I was kind of focused on is, okay, out of all of this like alternative medicine stuff, what works and what doesn't work. And so that was kind of my focus. That's what that's what kind of got me into residency at Harvard and all that good stuff.
So you mentioned reflexology that we both share a passion for. Curious about that one, and what have your findings been in terms of the broad strokes of Eastern modalities that are useful or not are useful? Because I actually think they can be useful even if you can't find it in the paper that says it. But yeah, what have you found?
So I think that a ton of stuff is very, very, very helpful. And I've seen many things from Eastern medicine that would be considered medical impossibilities. So like it's super wild. But like even if you think about something like meditation, 60 years ago, if you said there is one treatment, and people made these claims, there's one thing that you can do that will improve all mental illnesses. And this seemed medically impossible because each mental illness is its own pathology, has its own neurochemistry, has its own genetic sort of stuff. It's impossible to think that there's one treatment that works for everything. But we literally have one treatment that works for everything, and it is meditation.
Wow.
And the reason for that is because all mental illnesses to some extent exist within the mind. And what meditation does is actually, it's the practice of transcending mind entirely. So all the crap that is in the mind like no longer matters because you're kind of operating outside of mind.
So, and that's inclusive of like bipolar disorder and narcissistic personality disorder, like personality disorders and...
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, that's what we know, right? So now we have enough studies where people will do mindfulness for narcissistic personality disorder, mindfulness for bipolar disorder, mindfulness for mood disorders, mindfulness for anxiety disorders, and they all show positive outcomes.
Wow. That has a strong implication. And as you said, these are... When I think of the understanding as you described is like, well, these are all very different things that happen to people that need to be treated with different medications. It has strong implications for how these sorts of things arise. And one of the things that you mentioned in the video that I really liked is that, we've had this pandemic of COVID, but we've had in the Western world and in a lot of the developed world, an epidemic of mental health illness. It is the most likely thing that kills young men is themselves because of, which is crazy because if you look at, watching Nat Geo, you see people in the bush, you ask them, tell me about self-hate, and they cannot understand the concept of it, right? What is life about? And they look at each other like, what is life about?
What does that even mean?
He says meat. Yes, meat. That's what it's about. And then, they go get the honey from the tree. And so I have thoughts on this, but I'm curious, what do you think is driving that? Is that a natural outcome of achieving some of the lower levels of Maslow's hierarchy that people start being angry at themselves? Is it a function of a particular issue in Western society in the developed world? Is technology taking us there in a way that it doesn't have to?
Yeah, so I think the answer, so your question is like, why are we having a mental health crisis?
Yes. Is this necessary in, as you solve the bottom rungs and you're no longer hungry, do people just start having, turning inward and feeling bad about themselves?
Yeah, so I think the answer is kind of all of the above. So there's a really interesting story. And there's a really interesting observation. So if you look at all of the beings that attained enlightenment, so these are people like Buddha, and there are other like religious figures. So if you look at Krishna and Ram, these are considered in the Hindu tradition to be avatars of Vishnu. I think if you sort of look at it from like a not religious perspective, but an anthropologic perspective or a scientific perspective, there are some human beings that have been able to attain a certain state of consciousness where they essentially like a religion crops up around them and people believe them to be divine, right? That's what happened with Buddha. Buddha was, and so just perspectives on divinity and stuff, we call those people gods. But what we sort of know historically is that there were real human beings that were different in some way and were so different and so profound that they like, people thought they were like, this person is on a whole different level.
Yeah.
And the really fascinating thing is if you look at the histories of those people in ancient India where Buddha, Ram, and Krishna all grew up, there were 4 castes. And so Brahmins are the priest caste. They're the highest caste. So these are the people that are the closest to God. They do all the religious rituals. They also are the teachers of meditation. And below that, you have the Kshatriyas, which are the noble caste. So these are the kings. And the really fascinating thing is none of the priests ever become enlightened. The only people who become enlightened are kings. And then the question is kind of like, wait a second, why is that? Because Buddha, when he was like 10 years old, had a priest who would come to the palace and teach Buddha how to meditate. But that Buddha's teacher was not enlightened. Buddha became enlightened. And the really interesting thing is what I think the best explanation of this is that thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So what happens is the priest comes to the palace in the morning, teaches the king, and then eats like maybe a wondrous meal, like a delicious meal, and then kind of goes back to their hut and sleeps on their straw pallet. And so there's like a seed of dissatisfaction. They haven't had all of their desires fully satisfied. And actually what happens with the kings is that they achieve everything. So Buddha was powerful, he was respected, he was loved, he had a healthy son, and so he had everything that he wanted. And yet you wake up one day and you have nothing left to chase. And you are unhappy. And that's when you really start to get screwed, because we all think that, okay, like I'm unhappy, but if I get this thing, if I can get this person to fall in love with me, if I can make more money, if I can achieve this thing, if I can win the Nobel Prize, we all have some kind of desire that has not been fulfilled. But what happens is as people start to fulfill desires, they start to they wake up and they're not happy, but they have everything that they want, and then they're screwed. Yeah. So the true spirituality starts with the satisfaction of all desires. And so I think what's happening as a society is we've conquered a lot of problems. So, 200 years ago, the average lifespan was maybe like 50 to 55 years. And then like we developed dwarf wheat. And so like nutrition, we kind of conquered nutrition. And now like more people die of eating too much as opposed to like starvation. And even from a physical standpoint, like we've conquered the body in a lot of ways. Like I can literally like take your heart out of your chest, hook you up to a machine, and stick another person's heart into your chest.
Yeah, and send me on my way.
And you can live a normal life.
Yeah.
We can replace your lungs. We can replace your kidneys. People live with dialysis where they're like, getting dialysis like three times a week. And so as we're sort of fixing all this stuff, like we haven't figured out how to conquer the mind.
Yeah.
And so that's why I think we're seeing a real mental health crisis, because people have their basic needs satisfied.
I think that's like, as you say that, to me, it feels like a beautiful reframe, which is this is not merely, and I think it is, an illness. It is the birth pangs of the next potential level of evolution for a lot of people. Does that resonate?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fascinating way to put it. Absolutely.
Yeah,
right?
Because I think, I have in the past, when when you're talking about the Buddha, I don't claim to enlightenment, but I had that moment where I got it all, I had the thing, and then it didn't, and I never knew that I had been future projecting to this moment of having everything. But when I got there, I was like, oh my God, this is what I had implicitly assumed would solve the problem.
Yep.
And it didn't. And that was devastating. And what's so frustrating is I can't go back to that prior innocence of imagining that I sometimes pray and wish that I could just think that another achievement would do it so I could wholeheartedly dedicate myself to it in the way that I did before. But I can't. Yep. I cannot unlearn.
There's something very comforting about chasing something that you don't have, because
so
it
gives
your life like direction, right?
Yes.
If I have this, then I will be happy. If I have, I've worked with a ton of people who are in like finance and like entrepreneurship, and they really love. It's torturous, but it's like how they form the direction in their life. Like I'm going to do this next. I'm going to do this next. I mean, I saw it in academia, right? Like you start off as a resident, then you become an attending, and then you've got like a junior faculty position and senior faculty position, and then you want to be chief of psychiatry. And so there's always like ladders to climb.
Yeah. And then you take the ladders away, and this is where we don't need to go. We don't need to have another therapy session. But yeah, then I think that maybe what people in my position, or I don't know if the Buddha felt this, but it's what fuels me to do anything. And then there's the fear of I'll just sit and do nothing if I don't have that hole, that lack that makes me move towards a thing.
And that's actually where I think technology comes in, because what we're seeing with technology is that technology tells us what to do so easily. So they tell us, buy this thing, play this game, this will solve your unhappiness. And so we're externalizing our attention, and we're always being prompted to do something, right? There's all kinds of like notifications and CTAs and like the external world is telling us to be something else, to do something else. And so what's sort of happening, this is kind of what we see, is like there's a loss of like purpose and direction in life. And that's because we've outsourced what gives us direction to technology.
Mm-hmm.
And the more that we externalize our attention, the more disconnected we become with ourselves.
Yes.
So as I look at particular ads and then I go out and I buy stuff and stuff like that, then it's not really me that wants that. It's whatever the advertisement is that's convincing me that I want it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's what I've felt in my deeper levels of introspection is that it's easy to blame technology and say, wow, and it's true. Like, this is an asymmetrical game of trying to convince people to want things. You've got entire marketing teams fueled with AI that are coming at your limbic system. That is all true. And there's a trade that I'm getting something out of by buying into the consumption game. I benefit from this in the way that you just described, which is it enables me to escape me. I get to then look to this purchase, this thing, this future achievement, and not address the fact that there is a condition that I have, chosen or will not see through that is causing suffering at some point.
Yeah. So, I mean, and we sort of know that neuroscientifically as well, right? So like as long as I'm playing video games or even on social media, it's actually going to suppress my limbic system. I sort of felt this front and center where like I was failing out of college and I could tell. So I remember like in Spanish class, you could miss a certain number of days before they knock you down a whole letter grade. And so at the beginning I could get an A if I did well, right? But then I missed too many days and now the highest grade I can get is a B. And that was terrifying that I can't, this is my first semester. And I was like, okay, so 4.0 is now impossible in college because the highest grade I can get is a B. And then I had to escape from that into video games. And then the highest grade I could get was a C. And then the highest grade I could get was a D. And so then I just, like, I skipped my Spanish final because the best grade I could possibly get was a D. And then I wound up with an F.
Is there a healthy way to engage with distraction?
Absolutely. So okay. I think this is where you say engage with a distraction. So that implies intentionality.
Okay.
So I would say the simplest thing about healthy or not healthy is who is choosing to do it. When the distraction controls you, when you can't choose to engage with it, like when it's engaging with you, then it becomes unhealthy. But distractions, like, it's a really normal part of like healthy mental functioning. Like we all want breaks. We all need to be distracted.
Yeah. I knew that I needed to wake up earlier than usual, and last night it was midnight. I was like, I'm going to play League of Legends. But it was a choice. It was a conscious choice. I knew that I would have a little bit less sleep, but I would be ready. And I thought of you. We won 2 in a row. Nice. If we had lost, this would be I wouldn't have gotten any sleep.
So the challenge with games at midnight is that you can't quit on a loss and you can't stop with a win.
Yes.
So like,
Is it true? We'll come back to it. The gamblers, they say, are addicted to the loss. Does that have any merit?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of research that actually shows that the reason that video games and gambling, the reason they're so addictive is actually the denial of a reward.
I feel that because you just like you said, like I actually can stop on a win, but I cannot stop on a loss. Yeah. That is where the compulsion is. One more, my eyes will be watering, and it's just I cannot walk away with that.
Absolutely, because I think we sort of know that. So if you look at the human brain and what the brain likes, so we as a society value things that are difficult. So why do we respect, let's say, like doctors or lawyers more than like fast food workers? It's because their achievement is difficult. So we have this value system that rewards things that are difficult. Now, this is kind of at the cultural level and at the neuroscience level. So if you even think about something as simple as a child that's learning how to walk or even pick up an object. A child who's trying to pick up a ball will fail like thousands of times. And yet there's something in our brain that impels them to keep trying. So anytime we have difficulty and we're denied a reward and then we get the reward, that's what actually releases like a very high amount of dopamine.
Yes.
And so the thing about video games is if you win 100% of the time, the game becomes boring.
That's why I can't play Diablo. Just I can't get through the first year. It's like, no, play it 3 times and then you'll get to the hard part. It's like, I can't do this and not die ever. It's uninteresting to me.
And that's why these games like, League of Legends, for example, has been out for, I think, over a decade.
Stomped half the time.
and you get, yeah, right? So that's the beauty of like MMR calibration and ranks and stuff like that. So they're going to keep you sort of in the 50-50 bracket. Maybe you're winning 55% of the time or something like that. And so it's the denial of that reward. And so you don't know what you're going to get.
Yeah.
Also has to do with things like random reinforcement schedules and Skinner boxes and stuff like that, where like, I don't know if y'all are familiar.
Yeah.
Right.
No,
So,
I'm the pigeon.
yeah.
Pushing that button, just hoping to feel that hit of dopamine.
Absolutely.
So you had asked me in our conversation, and I got to tell you, it put me on a research rabbit hole. At the end of it, you said, "What's going on with men's mental health?" And I spoke to my perspective on it, but I hadn't thought about it in those terms, and I wanted to reflect back to you.
Sure.
Maybe just lay the groundwork. I think because I had to learn some of this through research. What is going on in men's mental health, and then what do you think is driving the issues that we're seeing?
Well, I mean, you said you did some research.
So here's what I understand. Boys are, where to begin? The suicide rate for both boys and girls is going up. Boys are having more difficulty in school. They lost a while ago. They're leaving college. They're more likely to be living at home with their parents after a certain age. Mental health issues of all different kinds and diagnoses are going up, and I'm not sure if that's because we're diagnosing more correctly, more frequently, or if that's because we're actually seeing more instances of this. You got ADHD and all these other things on the rise. I'm sure you could add a ton to the list, but I looked at the boy crisis. I looked at a number of different books about this, and my thought was, I wonder if young men in societies are generally the canaries in the coal mine because they're one of the most volatile demographics in terms of outcomes. Like if there's a war, that's your demographic that goes and dies. If there's a boom, that's your demographic that goes and joins Google and has wonderful success. So I wonder if young men are having unique problems or if they are just more likely to actualize harm on themselves given what society is going through writ large.
Yeah, so I think all that stuff sounds accurate. Mm-hmm. I think, so my take is that there's a bunch of science that we understand. So, but I would say one of the key things that's happened is that the world has changed, but we have not allowed men to change or boys to change with it. So, I was just talking to some friends of mine about who do they choose to engage in romantic relationships with. And even though I think it's wonderful that feminism has advanced and we've come closer and closer to equality. And so it's really cool because if you're a woman today, you can choose to have a career, fantastic, or choose not to have a career. And both of those are equally respected. If you're a man, I don't think that's the case. So people will if you're a dude and you're yeah, I just want to be a stay-at-home dad. A very good friend of mine is a stay-at-home dad, but he's the minority, and his wife is amazing and stuff like that, and they're very understanding. But I think what's happened is we still expect the same things from men, even though society has changed. So we expect a man to be able to provide, for example, but that's becoming objectively harder. Mm-hmm. And so there's just a lot of stuff around the expectations. So the world has changed, but expectations of men have not changed. And we have not adapted the way that we treat boys and men, which is precisely why, male suicide has actually been 4 times as common as women for decades. That's been there for a long time. So there's always been some kind of problem here. Yeah. But there's also other kinds of stuff I think emotional awareness is becoming more and more of a critical skill to survive in today's world. But there's this condition called normative male alexithymia, which is when men are colorblind to their internal emotional state. Mm-hmm. And the reason we call it normative male alexithymia is because all boys basically are taught this. Yeah. So boys, when they're growing up, are taught that one emotion is okay to express, which is anger.
Can we guess anybody?
Yeah. Right. And even when I talk to when I work with, men or even boys in my practice, it's the first thing is okay, what are you feeling? Well, I'm pissed.
Yeah.
I just got dumped and I'm pissed. Yeah. But they're not able to understand that, okay, I feel shame because I'm not worthy. I feel terrified that if I got dumped once, I may never be able to find love or no other future partner may accept me. But all we're sort of aware of is anger. Mm-hmm. So there's certain things that as the world is evolving, we're not really sort of supporting men and teaching them the skills that they need.
Yeah. I don't agree with this perspective I'm about to talk about, but I'm wondering if you can speak to it, because there seems to be a camp of, I don't know if it's best to characterize them as red pill or conservative or traditional, that say that, yes, the world is changing, and rather than have boys develop emotional skills, we need to recognize that that is not really good for men to do. That's not what men ought to do. That's not how men biologically are. And what we need to do is have a society that supports more traditional gender roles where the man is always the provider. And the woman, we need to, she needs to get back into a more traditional role for women. I'm curious if you can speak to your perspective on that, because it does seem that a lot of people have identified the problem, but there's not a consensus on the solution that, we should have more space for men to investigate their emotions, be stay-at-home dads. It's,
Yeah, so I mean, I think in a weird way, this is going to sound kind of weird, so give me a chance to explain. I don't think they're wrong. So let's just, and it's like very simple. Like it's just, okay, so if there's a certain set of characteristics and the world is a certain way, let's say I'm a certain way and society is a certain way, that can work.
Yes.
And then if society changes, then either I need to change or society needs to change. It just needs to fit.
I love it.
So, if we did go back 100 years or 200 years, then men would not need to change. Right? But I'm not advocating that we should go back, but I think that their solution is theoretically viable.
Yeah.
In the sense that we could go back in time and start to develop more traditional stuff, and then men would not need emotional awareness because we didn't need it back then.
That's awesome. Because are you familiar with spiral dynamics at all?
No.
It's the idea that both human consciousness and culture evolve in predictable stages, and generally, like the pinnacle, though people like the Buddha will just slingshot past it. You can go as high as the culture that you're in. So it takes you like. One of the stages is the power stage. You think of like Conan the Barbarian. It's like, do we need men to be more emotional in the stage of tribal warlords, and should they be talking about their feelings? That's probably maladaptive, that particular stage, so that these things, that the match is so much more important than, and people can argue about which ought to change. Should we go in this direction with society, or should we, I would argue that it's an upward spiral, and that there's benefit to saying, yes, we can step into a more emotionally aware place, but I see that it could work as a traditional gender roles will go in this direction.
Yeah, so I tend to agree that moving backwards is not good. So like just a simple example of this is that, people will sort of look at, if you look at statistics on divorce rates. So divorce rates tend to be higher in the Western world and lower in like places like India. And people will look at that and they'll say like, oh, divorce is bad, right? But what they don't sort of acknowledge are the studies that show that in a marriage in which divorce does not take place, abuse is much more common, domestic violence is much more common, sexual assault is much more common. So they sort of say that, okay, like marriage is good, but they're not really looking at the data that shows what a bad marriage looks like.
Yeah.
And people will say, okay, single parent households are destroying kids, right? Because like kids need a family unit. And there's actually good evidence to support that. If you've got two healthy parents who are there to care for you, the mental health of the child will, generally speaking, be better. But what those people also ignore is, what if you have one abusive parent or one alcoholic in a particular society where, like, okay, the parents say, I'm going to divorce you because you're an alcoholic. You are actually helping the kid by removing that influence.
Yeah.
So there's just like the effects of when people are sort of stuck in a marriage, it can actually be very damaging to kids because we're sort of assuming that those marriages are healthy, which they're not.
Yes. And there are subsets of marriage, and this seems obvious, but when people cite broad studies that can get lost, subsets of marriage that would benefit from, okay, we should stay together, work it out for the sake of the children, and others that would go, no, you guys need to split so that the children have the best chance possible and you as individuals.
Absolutely. So I tend to find that, people who are more traditionalistic, I don't disagree with their theoretical point that if you can maintain a more traditional marriage that just has two parents, I haven't seen a whole lot of data that, for example, heterosexual couples are healthier than homosexual couples or less healthy or anything like that. We just don't have a whole lot of data on that. But generally speaking, if you've got two healthy adults in your house raising a couple of kids, that's going to be better than one adult. And so they're right there. I think just the thing is the devil's in the details, and they don't really look at the studies that show, okay, what actually happens when you force two people to stay together and there's domestic violence, there's substance use, there's physical abuse, there's sexual abuse, because all that crap goes on in India and we just sort of sweep it under the rug.
Interesting. Yeah, just for a little color, I don't know if this will, the spiral dynamics, it names stages based on color. So the one stage that they go in order, this is like the middle of it, is blue, orange, green. Blue is what you would associate with, you call it the Dark Ages or like medieval times, which is authoritarian, top-down, hierarchical, patriarchal, and that would be a more, traditional male-female relationship with rules about how things goes. Boys don't date boys. This is how it is. Then society evolved into a capitalist, mercantilistic society, which was merit. Whoever can win is the best. And that's sort of where America's center, I would say, is in this capitalist, meritocratic, win sort of mentality. And the stage that comes after that is green, which is based on multiculturalism, heart-centered, tolerance. And it seems like there is this, which direction are we going to go? But to your point that is well taken is, any of them work. You can have, you need people who fit the context of their surroundings and the society. And there's been happy families, I think, always.
Yeah. So it's really fascinating because sometimes when I talk, and we've done a ton of work with like people in the manosphere and red pillars and stuff like that. And I think that they actually have a lot of like good stuff. It's just unfortunate that there's also a lot of toxicity associated with it. But, one thing that I've sort of found is when people are really, really angry at society, they don't really realize that anger doesn't actually come from society. It comes from
thank you.
It comes from their experiences. So,
gosh.
For example, the number one, I've worked with a ton of people who are incels or red pillars or whatever, and the number one thing that is common amongst all of them is trauma usually associated with a woman.
Yes.
So something just incredibly traumatic and crushing happened to them. And so then what they have to do is it's sort of like, it's a survival mechanism. Their brain adapts to fear and even hate that thing, right? Like if I get bit by a snake, I'm not going to want to cuddle with snakes.
Yeah.
And then I think they really fall into traps because as you start to like intellectualize and you point at society instead of like understanding your own bias and what effect it has had on you, then you really start to screw things up because if the problem exists within you, like no amount of changing society is going to fix it.
Yes.
And I've also worked with tons of people who will carry their problems with them.
Yeah.
Right. From one relationship to the next, like relationship baggage, things like that.
I see this. This is one of the most common things that I find in any political debate, argument, whatever, is people universalize their personal experience. And it seems as an emotional defense because it is, I can talk to myself, but it is much harder to confront the issues that you have with your father than it is to confront the issues that you have with authority generally. And that was one that I bristled under any authority and daddy issues, period. And I don't mean that in a demeaning or diminutive way. I have had to work with and through them in order to see, oh my gosh, how many of my political beliefs or ways that I've lived my life or ways that I've set up relationships are coming from an inability to put the pain where it needs to be put and then to move through it in that place. Because when you put it in society and then try to fight or push society, it can feel righteous and heroic, but you will, it's perfect because you'll never win because that's not where the problem is.
Yep, right. So
in the same way you can pursue.
I was going to say the same thing. So then you're back to a ladder, right? You're fighting
Yes.
this uphill battle that you'll never win, and it gives you purpose and it gives you direction and things like that. And I think those battles can be worthwhile fighting.
There can be positive externalities and outcomes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think that's where usually when I'll work with like men, for example, who have very like toxic attitudes towards society, if we do some internal healing, they can still advocate for things in sort of a healthy way. You can still advocate very strongly, but you're not advocating from like a place of emotional lack of control or lack of awareness. So you can still advocate for like male mental health, like equality for men, like reductions in male suicide, things like that. But you can just sort of do it in a healthier way.
Yeah. Just as another example, my girlfriend is in animal rescue, and there's people that I have seen in animal rescue, not all, but often have issues with people, and they project pure innocence and love onto the animals that they rescue, and they hate people. They hate them. And it leads to a tremendous tenderness and love that you see in the willingness to give, but also that it's not curbed with how can we best deploy our efforts. It's reactive caretaking, and it makes them less effective that they could be at their mission. And I see this everywhere.
Yeah, it's such a great observation. I'd never thought about that, but it sounds spot on.
In my experience,
I've seen this a lot with also people like children who are parentified. So they learn very early on to like let go of their own feelings and like take care of a parent. And they sort of like focus on taking care of the parent. Like we'll see this in parents who have chronic illness.
Yeah.
And the kid kind of takes care of them. And then they sort of change the way that they relate to human beings. And in that way, like they oftentimes will become animal lovers, right? Because they're sort of used to being caregivers, but there's oftentimes some degree of toxicity when it's like two humans. Whereas as far as I know, I mean, I've met a couple of nasty cats, but generally speaking, there's like less toxicity between animals and humans.
I met some cats that I would say.
It's only cats. I don't think I've ever met like a toxic dog.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure they exist, but
one of the questions I guess I wanted to ask, and maybe this isn't healthy, as I have gotten, I think, healthier in my mental place, I see subclinical issues, both in myself and in society writ large. You talked about some of the finance people that you've worked with that are totally workaholics. Is it useful, do you think, to view the world through that lens of like, we have subclinical mental illness that is endemic to the way that most people live their lives? Or
yeah, so let's just kind of define our terms.
Sure.
So HG, so I'm a psychiatrist, but we now work with we've worked with over 14,000 people across 121 countries, and we focus exclusively on subclinical stuff. So let's understand like what that means.
Yes.
So this is what I actually loved about India and medicine and how I kind of combine the two. So the practice of medicine is dealing with illness. Illness is pathology. It is something that is broken, that is not working the way that it is supposed to. So a simple example is, let's say I've got diabetes. So my body is supposed to absorb sugar at a certain level, but my body has insulin resistance. And as my body becomes insulin resistant, it's unable to absorb sugar properly, and then my blood vessels literally get clogged up with sugar, and it causes damage, microvascular damage. So this is not the way that the body is supposed to work. Something is malfunctioning. So when you talk about pathology of the mind, it's something that is not supposed to work that way. So bipolar disorder is a really good example of this. People who are in manic stages will sleep between 0 and 2 hours a day for a week. And they'll be very, very like energetic. They have tons of energy, but they're completely like disorganized. So they'll write a book that makes no sense that no one else can understand in a week.
Yeah.
And so this is not the way that the mind is supposed to work. Now, the interesting thing is that medicine treats everything, I would say, below 0. So if you're like negative 100 to 0, trauma, anxiety, depression. But spirituality and the meditative path, meditation or mindfulness was never supposed to be a treatment. That's not what it was designed for. What meditation is supposed to do, or spirituality is supposed to do, is move you from 0 to 100.
Understood.
And so subclinical stuff is in the space of 0 to 100. And so what we really think about here is things like motivation, purpose, procrastination. Procrastination is not an illness. It's not a pathology. It's not actually like wrong. It's the way that our brain works. It's a feature, not a bug, which is why everyone procrastinates. And our brain just simply has this circuit where it discounts, it does future discounting. So things in the future are worth less. And that's smart, by the way. And so, these are all the ways that we're supposed to function.
Yeah.
But if you want to go from baseline function to, optimal function, then we're sort of moving into the subclinical space.
Can I ask you about the word supposed to? Because that feels like a very loaded term. In our current society, what one is supposed to do is potentially work 90 hours a week to the detriment of one's own heart. And I'm curious, how do you conceive of supposed to? And for people, is it based on their own personal goals? Do you come in and say that there is an ideal platonic form of human flourishing that we would want to see? How do you think about supposed to? Because sort of in my question was this idea that it's you're supposed to post on Instagram. You're supposed to be obsessed with the way you look. You're supposed to do all of these things that I have found unhealthy in my own experience.
Yeah. So I think that shoulds, which is when I work with people like clinically or in a coaching standpoint, like we talk about shoulds a lot. So where do shoulds come from? So shoulds come from a couple of places. One is society. So the more that you consume, for example, social media, the more that we see filters being used on social media, the more people feel like they should look a certain way. So it kind of reinforces that. The second place that shoulds come from, the most powerful place usually that shoulds come from, are actually our family upbringing. Yeah. So that's when we internalize what we should be doing. And I don't think shoulds are evil because, I mean, that's how society functions. So shoulds are, I don't know if this is kind of a good analogy, but shoulds are the way that we know how we fit into particular pieces of society. So for example, I should wash my hands after I take a dump.
I should share my toy. I should not hit my sister.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Right? So we are not, they teach us how to relate to other people. And the third place that shoulds come from is usually some amount of internalization of the other two, where then what happens is people think that the shoulds come from themselves, and we internalize that because I've been taught that I should be this, I should look this way. Everyone else is kind of doing it that way. And then we kind of internalize it, and then we carry that should with us.
Yeah.
So a big part that we sort of help people do is to understand where is the origin of your should.
Yeah.
And once you're able to reflect on it instead of being like automatic about it, then what we sort of find is that people can kind of internally explore and decide for themselves, okay, is this a value that I was given? Is this a value that I want to keep? Is this something that I want to move towards? And that's actually exactly like what happened with me, where like I grew up the kid of two doctors, and my dad, when I was like 9 years old, was like, I have an older brother, and he's like, one of y'all is going to be a doctor and one of y'all is going to be a lawyer. And so I went to college and I was going to be pre-med and I wanted to go to Harvard and all that stuff. And I failed out because I was doing it because I should. And then paradoxically, what happened is I stopped caring about what I should do. And I really just wanted to learn everything that I could about how a human being works. And as I devoted myself to that, it was really bizarre. When I graduated from medical school, I went to Tufts for medical school. I didn't even go to the award ceremony because I didn't think I would ever get an award because I'm failing out. And I was like at the top of my class.
Oh, wow.
And I like wasn't even there to get it. And I just never even looked at my grades.
Wow.
And so ended up matching. And it was really bizarre because the second that I stopped caring about what I should do and devoted myself to something that I really cared about is when I achieved all the things that I had set out to achieve.
I got to ask you about shoulds because I carry, and I know a lot of people do, not with all of them. Some of them I've been able to break quite easily, but there are deep shoulds that there's a tremendous attachment to, and this irrational fear that if I let go of this should, I will, in my own case, become a person that is not safe to be around, or like, you know, my morality is based on not some internal connective tissue, but I, you know, have been conditioned to be kind to other people. So for me, just so that you have a bit of context, I struggle a lot with guilt. And I think, as I've sort of uncovered it, I have this inner fear of badness, that if I don't have a strict Jiminy Cricket moral code that drives me, that I don't even know what would happen, that something would let go and be bad and could hurt other people. And I'm curious of your perspective on, I guess, humans in general. Do you believe that people as adults are generally good when they drop their shoulds, or does society descend into chaos if we don't have that heavy hand of morality that has been carried through and internalized from childhood?
So I think whether it's healthy or unhealthy depends on, once again, who's in control. And this is the big thing that I learned in India. So a should is neither good nor bad. A desire is neither good nor bad. A coping mechanism or a distraction is neither good nor bad. Video games are neither good nor bad. Eating fried chicken is neither good nor bad. Drinking alcohol is neither good nor bad. And I did one set of interesting sadhana, which means spiritual practice, with this group of people called the Aghori Babas. So Aghori Babas, they're like really famous, like in terms of like pictures. So they'll be like on the cover of National Geographic. These are like the Indian mystics that have dreadlocks. Oftentimes they'll like smoke marijuana. They live in cemeteries, and they like don't wear clothes, and they just cover themselves with ash.
Okay.
And what Aghor means fear, and is like the opposite of fear. So they like have this spiritual philosophy of like no fear. So even if you look at in spirituality, they're like, you should be pure, right? So what a Gauri sadhana really is, and they're Shaivites, so they're like or Shiva oriented. And so they're like, we're going to understand the nature of like how things work by engaging in all of the unhealthy practices. And so they do things like eat meat, they'll drink alcohol, they'll smoke pot. And people are like, wow, that sounds great. It's actually one of the most difficult sadhanas that you can do because they do it with an intense amount of awareness.
Yeah.
And so the real thing about whether something is good or bad is who's in control. Is the should in control, or are you in control of the should? When I wake up on, yeah, go ahead.
It just seems that, which I don't know if I'm discovering myself or projecting onto what you're saying, that there's this idea that the you behind it, that there is goodness in that you can be trusted without the reins. Is that fair to say, or I don't?
Yeah. So I'm, but absolutely, and this is where we get kind of into weird territory.
Who is you? But yeah.
Yeah. So I work with a lot of like sociopaths, actually. So if you look at like some of the executives that I've worked with, even surgeons and psychiatrists.
Thank you for going here, because this is my question. What if they don't have their shoulds?
Yeah. So I work with a lot of these people that are very successful, and even psychiatrists and surgeons test highly on the sociopathy scale compared to the regular population. And that too is somewhat adaptive because sociopaths are like not empathic. But as a psychiatrist, if you let your empathy, if you're 100% empathic with every single patient, you will be torn apart because you'll just be ingesting all of their negative emotion. So you have to learn how to put up those barriers.
And I think that's important for people who, I'll speak for myself, who aren't a therapist or psychologist.
Yeah,
as
absolutely.
Well.
So there's a lot of people, and when I work with sociopaths, these are people with like antisocial personality disorder, not disorder because it's not non-functional, but they can be like real, like nasty people in some ways, is helping them understand. And these are some of the most moral people that I've met, but they're moral not out of feeling, but out of choice. And so we sit down and we really think about, okay, what kind of life do you want? What do you value? They don't feel like a good person and they're not controlled by guilt or things like that, but they make a choice that costs them, but they make that choice with awareness. And then they end up doing actually like amazing things. They're some of the best people that I know in terms of the value that they provide to society.
What informs that decision? Is it a simple calculation of this will do better in the long run? If I go friend in the friend or foe game, I will win in the end?
So some people do that. So that they're sort of, how can I say this, calculatingly altruistic.
Yeah.
Where they decide that they're selfishly altruistic.
Sure.
That altruism is the way to get the best stuff that I want. But oftentimes when I work with them, we go beyond that. So we don't make a logical kind of thing. What we really do is get to the self that is beyond mind.
That's what I'm curious. What is your perception? Talk about the self beyond mind.
So this is kind of weird, but because it's experiential, but let's understand a couple things. So who are you?
That has been a question I've been asking myself every meditation.
Okay, so let's just answer simply. Like, don't answer.
What I used to say is, I'm Charlie.
Great,
I'm a
let's start with that.
YouTuber.
Okay.
I live here.
Perfect, right?
Yeah.
So you're Charlie. You're a YouTuber. Have you been a YouTuber your whole life?
No.
Have you been you your whole life?
Yes.
Okay. So now this is interesting, right? So like, let's say I identify as a doctor. I identify as a dad. So I'll ask you a question. Would you identify as successful?
I would probably identify as successful.
In the past, would you identify as unsuccessful?
Yes.
Okay. So if you look at,
do I fear in the future that I may identify?
Sure. So this is and this is why I love the yogis, because we can get into this. The way that they understand the mind is different from the West, but and I think it's much more helpful for a person, like from a subjective perspective. But so if we look at who you are, I identify with certain characteristics. I'm a man. I'm a dad. I'm a doctor. But I was me long before I was a dad or I was a doctor, or even before I knew I was a man, right? Maybe I identified as a boy, and even before that, I'm always me.
Yeah.
So this is where in the East, there's this concept of ahamkara, which is loosely translated into ego, but the technical translation is the sense of I. So if you say, I am ... and you write down all of those qualities, all of those are a part of your ahamkara. I am rich, I am poor, I'm ugly, I am healthy, I am unhealthy. All of those states can change.
Yeah.
So, but if you really look at it, you've always been you. You were you before you even knew your name was Charlie. You were you after you were Charlie. You were you when you were successful. You were you when you were unsuccessful.
And would you contend that if I had bumped my head and had amnesia, that the me would persist? Like, does memory is required for this, or no?
Not at all.
Okay.
So this is where, and so all of the attributes that we identify with,
even our memories, even our
Sure, even our memories, right? So, and this is where it's super cool stuff. But I've had some interesting experiences in meditation with past lives. I've even done psychotherapy with people around past lives, which really changes the game of like understanding who you are, because they have an experience or a memory or a trauma that is actually not of this life. So then it's like, well, hold on a second. What does that even mean?
Well, I definitely want to come back to that. Yeah.
But so if we sort of look at it, the attributes of Charlie, the qualities of Charlie can change over time, but you've always been you. There's something that's always you, no matter whether you're successful or unsuccessful. And that is the true self. And that is sort of like the part that experiences everything else. So a good analogy is if you look at, like, let's say I'm watching a movie, all kinds of things can change on the screen, but the person who's watching stays the same, whether it's raining or shining, or whether people are happy or unhappy, whether you experience emotions, sadness, unhappiness, happiness, elatement, all of those things are fluctuations within the mind, but the experiencer stays the same. So you are the one who was successful. You are the one who was unsuccessful. You are the one who's ugly. You're the one who's happy.
And I have the capacity for any and everything is what it sounds.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so the cool thing about it, for people who are kind of lost here, it's the part of you that actually doesn't change at all throughout the whole course of your life.
So okay. And I know that the answer to this really depends on how far out we zoom and how, because that's been my experience, at least when you zoom out, it's all one. It's very simple. And then you zoom into varying degrees and you go, well, okay, there's separation at this level. But when you think of that true self, as you sort of described it, is there an essence other than spaciousness and potential? Is there, like what I have found, and maybe this is a different level down, that as I sink into trust and I let go of the shoulds, I find love. I find genuinely inspired, not calculated, unconditional love. And I don't live there, certainly, but I've touched it and I've seen it, and I'm trying to. It's a nice place to be, and I try to bring it more into my life. I'm curious if that is the nature of the true self in your perspective, or if it's simply it's unconditional love, and it's also anger and hate, and maybe those things aren't even opposite to one another.
I think that those are both kind of true. So this is when things get really weird. But so frequently, give me just a second.
Of course.
So generally speaking, what tortures us is our mind. So if you look at like shoulds, where does a should exist? It doesn't exist in your body. It doesn't exist in your taste buds. It exists in your mind. Your mind is what tells you what you should do. So the first thing to understand is that, let's say I'm walking along the beach and I'm so absorbed in the experience that I'm not even thinking. So all of those shoulds, when I'm walking along the beach and I'm watching a sunset, there are no shoulds in my mind. The second I start thinking, there can be shoulds. I can say to myself, oh, like I shouldn't be here right now. I should be studying for a test, or I should be going to the grocery store. I should be working out or whatever. But shoulds are literally thoughts, right? That's what they are. There's thoughts, they're emotions, and those things exist within the mind. So there are states of consciousness where you are aware without the activity of mind. So being absorbed in an activity, even sort of beyond the flow state, states of meditation can achieve this where you're aware, but you're not thinking. Another really simple one that a lot of people are actually super familiar with is orgasm. So orgasm is a point where you are completely present and not thinking at all. The moment of orgasm is and I've worked with a ton of people who are like, in the moment that you orgasm, you're totally fine. And then the second you're done, then all these thoughts start to arise. Right? Like, okay, was it good for the other person? Did I orgasm too early? Like, are they having a good time? Then all these like shoulds arise. But for that moment, it's really, really blissful. And this is where people think like, okay, orgasm is blissful because of all of these, like, let's say neurotransmitters or whatever. But what the yogis sort of figured out is anytime you can transcend mind and be aware, that is actually going to lead to bliss. And once you are in a state of bliss, the toxicity within you just disappears. So all the shoulds disappear, all of the entitlement disappears because you're just present in the moment. And this is why mindfulness and meditation try to help people to be in the present, because shoulds don't exist in the present. You can't do anything you should in the present. Should is about the things that you should have done in the past, right? By definition, shoulds are things that do not exist. You can never have a should that exists. It's the stuff that was supposed to exist. It's the stuff that exists in the future if you behave the right way, or it's the stuff that should have existed in the past. But shoulds can never exist in the present. And so as we move beyond mind, as we move into the present, as we sort of stop thinking and even feeling, then we experience things that when we translate into language, we use emotional language. So you'll say, all I experience is love. But it's not love, the emotion. It's like a different kind of love. And that's why in the East, we'll kind of call it like a transcendent love. And then there's also like all kinds of other weird stuff that we've got like interesting studies about psychedelics and the breakdown of the self. And so one kind of random aside is that, so human beings are selfish by nature, right? So like, I want to do things that are good for me. Once you realize that you are connected to all other human beings, selfishness becomes compassion.
That is, I'm glad, it's this increased sense of connection is what, in the same way that I would never eat my left arm because I'm hungry, I would just never, it's not a kindness in me, it's not a moral code, it is a simple fact of connection. Yes, I want the best for my left arm and my right arm, and there's a unified connection, and I feel that extend beyond my body and extend beyond my family or my business or whatever.
Absolutely. And so when I work with the sociopaths, it's kind of weird. How do I help them be moral? It's like you said, it's not morality. It's just the simple nature of things where they realize they can actually feel that connection. It's not empathy though. It's kind of weird. Like they have to get to higher states of meditation to achieve it.
Okay.
And then it's kind of weird, but like even that what is selfishness? It's self-love.
Yeah.
But when you are connected to other people, self-love kind of becomes compassion.
Yes, and it at the highest level, it sounds like selfishness is just beautiful. It's a
absolutely. There's not, and that's where even we get into the weird stuff, like you know, when you're saying is love, hate, all that kind of stuff. So at the highest states of meditation, what you experience is something called Advait, which is a whole philosophy called Advait Vedanta, which is non-dualism. And this is where what we start to realize with this Advait philosophy is that there's nothing good nor bad in life. All there is karma. It is human beings who attach value judgments to things that are good and bad, which sounds like one hell of a stretch because people will say like, of course
what
there's
about
good
this
stuff.
Horrible thing?
Yeah. And so this is where like, you know, I learned this kind of in an interesting way. Part of the reason that our brand blew up. So when I ended up at HMS, like
Harvard
I was
Medical,
with Harvard Medical School. So
for those
like,
of you not in the know,
right? So I was surrounded by people who had like 4.0 GPAs.
Yeah.
I was like the kid with a 2.5 when I graduated, less than a 2.0 for the first couple of years. And if you were to ask me, is there any situation in which case a 2.0 or Fs are better than a 4.0? I would say, of course not. Objectively, a 4.0 is better. But the reason that our brand grew is because I was the kid who had a 2.5 who wound up faculty at Harvard Medical School. And if I was a kid who was a 4.0, that's just normal.
Yeah. And not that you should wish more suffering because you'll find it in life, but I've, you know, from struggles given time is often that is not an uncommon experience, that the depths are what make the next they make it. They make the story.
Absolutely. So and this is where one of the things that I'm the most grateful for is actually like almost failing out of college because I know what it's like. And then when there are kids who are like almost failing out of college or who have failed, I can understand them in a way that I never would have. And we also see this, there's actually a lot of good science behind this as well, where you know, there's an emerging area of research called post-traumatic growth. And what we sort of know is that like when people when a population undergoes genocide, some people end up with PTSD and some people end up actually being stronger from it. And they find like purpose and meaning. And I've worked with so many patients who have like cancer and they'll tell me like, yeah, cancer was the best thing that ever happened to me. And I'm like, bro, what are you talking about? And they'll sort of notice that this is just part of their experience in life. They learned to appreciate so much more. They were taking things for granted. They were really like chasing this hedonistic treadmill or the success treadmill. And so if you really look at human experience, all it is what is. It can't be anything else. And the more that you meditate, the more that you begin to see that your judgments of what's good or bad actually comes from the mind.
Totally. One trap for those who are that I've listened to conversations like this and gone and skipped my, I don't have cancer, but like anger or rage and gone, find the happiness. And I have gotten a lot of mileage lately out of going, be where you are. Do not bypass this, because one of the things I feel like is just socially conditioned, which is perhaps necessary for children, is say thank you, say you're sorry, act out the gratitude, but there's not, or at least I wasn't taught, like, how do you genuinely cultivate gratitude? Well, I'm angry right now. Well, then let's be angry, get through the anger. And is there gratitude after you go through the things that we might deem negative experiences or states? So that was just occurring to me as you were.
Yeah, and I think it brings up a great point that, like, I think one of the biggest mistakes we make in society is thinking that some emotions are good and some emotions are bad. And so oftentimes the work that we do is we try, like, what holds people back is they run away from their negative emotions.
Yeah.
You even said, like, hey, like, how do I have this guilt? And you talk to me like it's a problem that you want to fix. Whereas, like, my honest answer to you is, like, don't ever fix your guilt. That's a part of you. It's something that you're going to live with for the rest of your life. It's just like any other emotion. It's like having a tic or having like a kind of a knee that acts up. It's just a part of the way that you're built. And the more that you're able to accept the guilt and not try to change it, the less you will suffer from it.
100%. And as I release into it, the information contained within is beyond what I understood. So it unlocks, oh my gosh, I see where this came from, or why this felt, or what this activated, the shame that this activated in me. And you had an interesting quote at the end of our conversation, which was, the only way for people to emotionally manipulate you is if when an emotion you have is tied to a behavior. And so that is something that maybe fixing isn't the right word, but that I've looked at and gone, oh wow, with guilt, I have a click word response. Guilt activated. Tell me what I did, I will undo. You know, like that. And that has been, I've been easily moved and manipulated in that way. And that is something that I would like to change, which I see the subtlety of. That's not fixing my guilt. That is
absolutely
becoming conscious of a pattern.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So here's the problem is that if you want to fix your guilt to fix your problems, the moment you become guilty, your problems return. You lose control over your life if you let your emotions control you. And that's what we try to do. Like, we try to make the sadness go away. We try to make the anger go away. Try to make the guilt go away. But literally what happens in the mind, we do not choose what we feel. And so everyone goes, and this is why, like, everyone's addicted to video games, is because they're trying to fix the negative emotion. And part of, like, half the work that I do is actually having people not move towards positivity. I think there's a ton of toxic positivity in our society where it's like, yeah, like, no, like, everything's a learning experience and, like, everything is a part of, like, growing. And, like, if something sucked and it shouldn't have happened to you, there is no positive to it. I know it's kind of weird because we just talked about...
Be with that, yes.
So we just talked about Advaita Vedanta, and this seems like a contradiction, but it really isn't. And what happens is the more that you accept... Like, sometimes I'll have people who have been traumatized and they'll be like, yeah, I'm trying to learn or grow from it. And I'm like, fuck that.
Be hurt. Yeah.
Be hurt. Yeah. And it's unfair. And there's nothing good that will come from this situation, and it shouldn't have happened to you. You don't deserve it one bit.
And I've been there. Through that.
Yeah, it's kind of weird.
Things... and it's almost like we stick when we want to be here on the evolutionary or enlightenment scale, we can't get past here. Yeah.
Absolutely. So it's kind of weird because even speaking of wanting to be here, so there's a really fascinating story with Buddha, which is that he engaged in a lot of very, very intense austerities. And he was like on the verge of death. So he had because people will say like fasting will help you attain higher states of meditation. There's some good scientific evidence of that. And so he starved himself to the point of death. And so he was like stick thin. And a young girl walks by with like a pail of rice pudding, and she sees that clearly there's like this, monk or something who like really looks like he's in bad shape. His skin is gray. He's all skin and bones. And she's like, do you want some rice pudding? And he's like thinking about it. And he's like, you know what? Yeah, Yeah, I do. I'm on the brink of death. None of this shit is working. I've been studying. I've been trying to become enlightened for so long. It's all a scam. And he gets frustrated. He has the rice pudding. It's the most delicious thing he's tasted. And then he goes and he sits under the tree and he's like, fuck it. I'm done with enlightenment. I'm done with meditation. All this shit is crap. And he just sits there and enjoys the rice pudding. And that's when he becomes enlightened. Yeah. So it's kind of bizarre, but even the desire for enlightenment is a desire that will keep you from enlightenment.
Sure.
And the last thing you have to give up is the desire for enlightenment. So it's kind of weird.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And so it's okay. I'll try to quit right now while I'm ahead. So there's actually a number of questions I've been meaning. This might be a foolish question. Are you enlightened, or is that perhaps not even the right formulation of the question?
It's a fair question. The answer is absolutely not.
Okay. Yeah.
Easy.
And is your understanding that enlightenment can be stabilized into a semi-permanent?
So enlightenment is permanent.
Okay.
So this is where so Sanskrit is a great language because they figured this stuff out. So there are different states of consciousness. There's
awakening and there's all this.
Yeah. So like we can even understand this from like a psychiatric perspective. So let's understand like what the steps on the ladder are. And it's actually surprising how like easy it is to understand. So the first is we have thoughts, but thoughts are not reality, correct?
I'm with you.
Okay. So we can be wrong about stuff. Mm-hmm. So what is an unhealthy mind? The most unhealthy mind is when thoughts are reality. Mm-hmm. So if we talk about people who are in acute psychosis, these people are delusional, they're hallucinating. These thoughts are by definition not real, but they believe they are real. Mm-hmm. So the distance between thoughts and reality is very small for people who are actively psychotic. Okay? This is the most unhealthy. Then what happens is we start to get into something like anxiety, where anxiety, the thoughts, you're not, you know they're not 100% real.
You come back every now and then, you realize I'm just in my bed and it's 2 a.m.
Right? But you are attached to your thoughts. You can't let them go. So even if you look at the neuroscience of anxiety, what happens is when our amygdala is active, potential things feel more real, which is survival. It's adaptive. So when I think about like, okay, if I see a snake, I don't think about the danger of the snake as hypothetical. It's not a hypothetical danger. When I see the snake, my brain is like, oh shit, that danger is real. We got to treat it as if the danger is real. Even though I haven't been hurt, but I am treating a hypothetical possibility as a reality.
Yeah. Anxiety is an extension of that.
It's an extension of that.
There might be a snake behind that thing,
right.
And I saw a snake here yesterday. Yeah.
You're worried, and then your life is determined by your thoughts. You start living your life based on your thoughts, okay? And then what happens is, like another good example of this is like a breakup, where when you first get dumped, let's say, you start to think all these thoughts that feel real. No one will ever love me again. It becomes a truth. I'll never find love. I'll never find love. This person got away. I'm going to be alone for the rest of my life. And you can tell that person logically, bro, that's not true, or girl, that's not true. Like, it's not true, but you believe your thoughts are true. And then even as people heal through the process of breakup, they start to understand, okay, my thoughts about this are not true. I will find love. And so the more separation that you get between your thoughts and reality, the healthier your mind becomes. And then like we start to enter into the realm of detachment. And once we enter into the realm of detachment, then sort of what starts to happen, if something bad happens and we have a healthy mind, we'll say like, okay, so like this person dumped me, but there are other fish in the sea. I have value as a human being. This doesn't determine my value. And then we start to move past zero.
Can I ask a question? Because even those, one of the things I've noticed is that there's disempowering thoughts and empowering thoughts. A lot of like self-help is about shifting disempowering to empowering, which has value. But I've also heard you like transcend thought, which is not I'll find people, but it's I'm good. Here I am now.
So like the taste of a sandwich does not change whether you've been dumped or you haven't.
Yes.
Right? Well, subjectively it can. So people will, food will taste.
Food doesn't taste as good. Yeah.
So there's stuff going on in your brain.
Okay.
But, but there are ways that you can shift your experience to appreciate a sandwich no matter what. And so what happens is as we start climbing into the phase of detachment, we pass the flow state, by the way, somewhere in there. And then we enter into the states of meditation. So these are transcendent states of mind. So the first transcendent state of mind is just awareness without mental activity. This is like orgasm. And then we enter into something called samadhi. And samadhi is a temporary state of enlightenment. And it's super cool. And then when samadhi becomes permanent, that is moksha, and that is permanent enlightenment.
Yeah.
So once you're like that, then you get shattered in some ways. So you see like ego death and ego dissolution. There's even stuff in the psychoanalytic literature about this kind of stuff where like, you know, there's all kinds of stuff that happens, but that's like that permanent state where you're living there all the time.
Wow. Scary stuff. I don't know that in me. I've had the samadhis and I feel the resistance to the shattering. I'm familiar with. I'm familiar with the shattering.
Yeah.
And first time it happened, it was terrifying. Just the most terrifying experience of my life. And I did it. Well, this can be our new topic, psychedelics. I'm curious of your perspective. I know that you work with people and this is important, especially since you're, you know, a doctor. This is not for everybody, but I'm curious broadly what your perspective on psychedelics is. I know you have a lot of experience with meditation, and what people who meditate often that I've seen don't tend to like psychedelics. So I'm curious if there is a crossover for you.
Yeah. So my perspective on psychedelics is kind of like multi-layered. So let's start with scientifically. So psychedelics are a tool that human beings have used as part of spiritual practice and healing for thousands of years. I think from a science perspective, we are seeing more and more research about the potential positive effects of psychedelics. Mm-hmm. So as a scientist, as a psychiatrist, you follow the research. If science says it's good, if outcomes are good, then it's good. A couple things that people don't understand is that psychedelics are kind of like playing with fire. So we have, there's these studies that show that it helps with things like PTSD, and we can get into how that works. It's really fascinating. Mm-hmm. So there's studies that show that it is potentially beneficial. Mm-hmm. Now, the tricky thing there is that usually those studies are done in conjunction with psychotherapy and in highly controlled environments. So you do some amount of psychotherapy, you get stabilized, and then you use psychedelics. And even if you look at the spiritual traditions, you have someone like a shaman who's very well versed in it, and it's not for everybody. Mm-hmm. So it's a tool that can be used to temporarily attain higher states of consciousness. They'll also do things like shut off your default mode network, which is the sense of self.
Yeah.
And when people are suicidal, by the way, the default mode network is actually hyperactive. So all they're thinking about is themselves.
Yeah.
If someone says, hey, I can't make it today, you don't think, oh, this person is busy. You think this person doesn't want to see me. So when someone is depressed, all of the thoughts come back to you. My family would be better off without me. Mm-hmm. I don't deserve to be here. I'm suffering. And
as we described before, because we've used you to mean a number of things, a very limited idea.
Yeah, so
of
ahamkara, for sure.
Yeah.
So not the true self,
Yes.
but like they just get stuck thinking about themselves. And so what psychedelics will help people do is break down that kind of barrier of self. And so they're not stuck thinking about themselves all the time. And that's specifically how ketamine works, by the way, because it's a dissociative agent. So you kind of dissociate, and that can be healthy. But the studies on psychedelics show that, they're done in highly controlled environments that are safe. There are also studies that show that psychedelics can both heal PTSD and cause PTSD. So I've worked with tons of people.
Both.
So I've worked with tons of people, and you don't hear about these other people that will develop permanent, or semi-permanent mental illnesses based on psychedelic trips. Mm. So the really scary thing is that a lot of people who hear, okay, psychedelics can heal me, will do psychedelics when they are hurting. And that can be one of the worst times.
Yeah.
So if you're in an acute mental illness, if you're in a depressive episode, manic episode, if you're in a really dark place, the psychedelic you'll lose control of. Mm-hmm. And then it can actually be damaging. So I think I'm cautiously optimistic. I was sort of against them, I would say 5 to 7 years ago. But if we're really being scientific, then we have to follow what the evidence says. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the direction that I'm moving in. So I'm cautiously optimistic. Mm-hmm. From a spirituality perspective, it's a whole different ballgame. So when you say that you were terrified of the ego shattering, what I would say psychedelics is it's taking a helicopter to 20,000 feet.
Yeah.
The problem, though, is that you can't go above that. You can't really hang out there too long, and you don't control where you go when you use psychedelics.
Well, I would distinguish between the different. So MDMA is much more like, I'm going to take this Fisher-Price helicopter up and have a nice little time. And the one that I'm thinking of is helicopter, rocket ship. No, absolutely no control. You're going and you're getting. You sit back and receive at this point.
Well said. And we can talk about, I'm using one term, but even, peyote, ayahuasca, DMT,
why it can be wildly
MDMA, psilocybin, ketamine, ibogaine. Each of these has discrete neuroscientific effects and even discrete like spiritual effects. So I think the basic problem with psychedelics is that you're not trained. So the difference between psychedelics and meditation, and let's remember, by the way, that psychedelics can't create something new. All they can do, these are chemical substances that activate your brain in new ways. They can't actually lay any new architecture. So the reason that opioid medication can reduce our pain is because we have endogenous opioids and endogenous opioid receptors. So everything that psychedelics can do, I suspect, can be endogenous. We have all the architecture, right? It's just activation, which I think a lot of people miss out on. So the thing about meditation is that when you meditate, you're trained. This is the case of a hiker going up to 20,000 feet. So you start at 1,000, start at 2,000, start at 3,000. So you can handle the experience way better. And then the other cool thing is that you can actually go above 20,000 feet. Now, I haven't done psychedelics. You could argue that psychedelics can take you all the way to the top. I don't believe that. And when I've worked with very, very veteran meditators who have done psychedelics, what I oftentimes find is they will sort of agree with me. And the states of samadhi through meditation, I think, are different. This is where it's super hard to describe because I haven't done psychedelics. But
psychedelics defy language as well.
Yeah.
Especially the more intense ones.
So when I've done I do a lot of like third eye practices and stuff like that. It's kind of weird, but like when I say like, okay, like I've seen into my past lives, for example, everyone thinks that that's like something like, oh, wow, like... So you have memories, right, of like what you ate. The only difference is I just have memories that are just not of this life. And it's not anything special or anything profound or anything weird. I just remember stuff that's never happened to me.
And what do you feel a distinguished sense of knowing? Because even in this life, we can have fabricated memories and, that people imagine things that didn't happen or see things that didn't happen. What do you feel a grounded sense of like, this of a reality to this that corresponds to a year in human history where there was some continuation of you? And
100%. So this is also where when you meditate a lot, you start to study the different experiences that you have. So imagination is different from experience.
Yes.
Imagining getting laid are like night and day.
This is one of the things that bothers me about NLP practitioners. Like the brain cannot tell the difference between something that is intensely imagined, and I understand the purpose of what they'll talk about when you're visualizing success and those sorts of things, but there is a difference between reality and imagination.
Yeah, that's because so NLP is very functional and it can help people, but it's like scientifically pretty hogwash, honestly. So it's a lot of extrapolations. The real studies behind it are kind of BS.
Yeah.
But I think what they've sort of what they've stumbled upon is stuff that is useful in activating things in human beings that will create positive behavioral outcomes. But I think their scientific mechanisms just aren't very good, at least based on last time I checked the research.
Got it. Well, didn't mean to throw you off there. So difference between reality of getting laid 100%. And imagination of getting laid. And that you were going into, where were we headed with that? With past lives and the reality or imagination of that and the knowing of the difference.
Yep.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So I think maybe like the best place to start is like talking about a patient. So, and this is what's kind of weird. So I've had some patients, and a lot of times the patients that come to me are the ones that did not do well or haven't been fully served by other mental health professionals. So sometimes I'll get people who are like refractory cases, where they've seen therapist after therapist after therapist, and they'll come to me because they want to try something else. Like they've been on all these medications and let's try meditation and see if it can help in some way. So, and the weird thing is I had this one patient that, and she's given me permission to share this, but we won't go into identifying details. But as we were working on this stuff, this person had seen a psychiatrist for 15 years, phenomenal psychiatrist, helped this person immensely. Person is on a very low dose of medication, is really living life, is professionally successful in relationships, successful in family, just really doing a phenomenal job at life, has a lot to be grateful for. And comes to me because their partner, I met their partner in a different setting, and they're like, hey, something about you, I wonder, like, would you be willing to work with my wife? And I'm like, sure, send her my way. So we're working for a while, and we're talking about all this weird woo-woo stuff and things like that. And so then one day she kind of comes in and she says, like, can I tell you something that I've never told you before? And I was like, absolutely. And so this person was so embarrassed because she had certain thoughts or memories that she knows never happened to her. So even for her psychiatrist of 15 years, she did not feel comfortable like telling them this stuff. And so she like tells me this like story of like remembering being like under floorboards. And she remembers like she's under floorboards, and if she makes a sound, people will find out that she's there. And she remembers booted feet walking above her and her being like absolutely terrified. And the source of her anxiety is like, she feels this way. She feels trapped, and she feels like if she does the slightly wrong thing, everything is over. And it was just such a powerful experience to her, except it never happened. And so what we did is process that trauma, and it was like eye-opening for her. We treated it as if it was real. Now, scientifically, what's going on here? We have no idea. So it's very possible that she watched a movie when she was 3, and the movie was so realistic to her that it traumatized her. So we don't actually know that this is from a past life. But from the sake of healing trauma, whether it's real or unreal, and this is what's kind of bizarre about trauma, is oftentimes trauma can be quite unreal, which is really bizarre, but their experience of it is real. And sort of helping people with that kind of stuff. And we kind of came to the conclusion, I just said, I have no idea. I offered her this explanation that maybe you watched a movie or something like that could be traumatizing. Honestly, doesn't feel like that to me. After working with you and hearing this, I am beginning to wonder more about past lives and whether these things are real. And now we even have some evidence of this. So we know that there's genetically inherited memory. So it's not even that you experienced it, but that experiences that your parents have can be inherited.
Tell me about that, because that doesn't match my prior understanding, which was, it's not blank slate, but you come in. So how have we learned that about memories? So we can follow. How do we follow a memory?
So it's this research is in its infancy, but there's a guy out in Israel who's basically spearheading it. I'm blanking on the name at the moment. But so if you kind of think about it, so if a human being sees a snake, so I have a 5-year-old daughter, and she saw a snake for the first time in the garden, and it was dead. And she completely lost it. She started crying. She ran inside. She was incoherent. She ran away from it. She didn't even understand it was dead. And so if you sort of think about that, hold on a second, like where does that fear come from? It's baked in. So evolutionarily, there are certain things that are like instinctual, right? So what is instinctual? It is like knowledge from the past in a weird way. That's one way to conceive of it, right? So we've been programmed to fear snakes. Now there's some evidence, so that may be at the level of genes, but now there's actually some evidence that epigenetic changes. So these are not changes in the DNA itself, but changes in the activation or disactivation or the way that basically genes are activated that can also be inherited.
So this is gross oversimplification, but it's like, in our DNA is the capacity to be easily made anxious. And if that is epigenetically activated in a generation, that can be passed down genetically speaking.
Yeah.
Okay.
Epigenetically, precisely.
Epigenetically. Because the capacity would be present
so
more broadly than just that family.
Here's the way to understand it. So like in the past, we used to think that the only thing that you pass down is the gene sequences themselves. But what happens when you go through life is so your genome doesn't change, but your epigenetic activation does change. The expression of those genes. So this happens every time you get a cold, every time you get a fever, your body actually changes. So there are epigenetic changes that will activate certain genes and shut off certain genes. So this is basically the accumulation of your experience in life does not change your DNA, it changes you epigenetically.
Okay.
And then now if we can pass on epigenetic changes, that means that practically what we're doing is passing on experiences of one life to another life. So this research, like I said, is really in its infancy, but there's some really fascinating initial studies that are really getting us to like turn a couple things on our head. And these studies actually started with Holocaust survivors, where children of Holocaust survivors exhibited some symptoms of PTSD. And so the prevailing theory was that based on the way that these children were parented, that's what caused the changing. It's not some change. It's not some genetic thing. It's like nurture. The environment of growing up with a Holocaust survivor will sort of induce some symptoms of PTSD.
Sure.
And there's definitely some of that that's true. But the more that we've gone into the science, more we've realized that nurture does not explain the whole effect.
Interesting. Wow. So let's do intuition first. Third eye practices. Working on a deep resistance to gnosis, if you will, knowing without constructing an edifice. I have loved analysis and piecing things together. And when I look at my own, it's because that's more easily communicated, shared, and understood by most people.
Yep.
Intuition, as I've come to develop some limited, well, probably less than limited, but as I allow more of it in, I experience these complete packages of knowing things that I oughtn't know. And it doesn't mean that I'm going to predict the lottery or anything, but it's even just as simple as like, what is right for me in terms of a career move or something like that, that wouldn't make, I'm not constructing it logically, but there's a sense. I'm curious, and I've seen tremendous value. How does one deepen one's connection to intuition? You mentioned third eye practice. You mentioned...
So I think the first thing that we have to do is understand the nature of knowledge. And the yogis did a fantastic job with this. And once we understand the nature of knowledge, then we can understand how to cultivate intuition. So the first thing that the yogis understood is that there are two kinds of knowledge. One is vidya, which means book knowledge. So this knowledge is intellectual, is transmissible, and is like you can record it, okay? The second kind of knowledge is jnana. So jnana is like knowing or understanding. So you can convey information or facts, but you cannot convey understanding. So this is where if we sort of understand what intuition is, what is intuition? It's not vidya, it's jnana. You can't calculate your way to knowing. We'll get to this in a second. And so these are two fundamentally different camps of knowledge. One is facts, information, transmissible. The other is understanding, knowing, experiential. So a really good example of this is, once again, sex. So you can't, no matter how much porn you watch, you're not going to know what it's like to have sex. You can even, if you watch a ton of porn, you can theoretically become a professor of sexual
dynamics
prowess, right?
Yeah.
Like, so here's how you should do cunnilingus, here's how you should do this, here's how you can do that by just watching a bunch of porn. I know it's fake, but you can sort of study a topic, right? And this is what academia is. It's kind of like, and it's really bizarre.
I went to business school with people that were 20-year veterans of business school who had never run a business. And
yeah, right. So there, and that knowledge has value. We're not saying that it doesn't have value, but so that's like information. The second one is jnana, which is understanding. Now, the biggest mistake that a lot of people make is if you think about like a book has information, but all of the knowledge actually comes from within you. I know it sounds kind of weird, but when I read a book, if the information is in the book, but the understanding is not in the book.
There's a resonance.
There's a resonance.
Yes.
So in the yogic sense, actually what they actually believe is that there isn't any understanding or even decent information even in books. What the book is a trigger for your internal understanding. And we all know this because there's this experience of, I don't get this, I don't get this, I don't get this. I'm going to read it once, I'm going to read it twice, I'm going to read it 3 times. I don't get it. But if the understanding was in the book, reading it once, if you're paying attention, should be sufficient. But even if you're paying attention, it may not be sufficient.
Versus you come back to that same book a couple years later, you go, aha.
So it's the aha. So the aha is the moment of jnana. So even in the most extreme sense, all understanding comes from within. Not a single bit of understanding comes from the outside world.
This was my experience of Eckhart Tolle, was, what the hell is this? And then I came back and went, oh, geez.
Yeah, right? So you have that aha moment.
Yeah.
So that's jnana. So now, if we understand like what Ajna Chakra practices are, so those are third eye practices, those are practices that, so we have a trigger of information out here and an understanding over here. And then the interesting thing is that the state of your mind determines how well the trigger triggers understanding. So I'll give you an example. If I'm reading a book and I'm in a burning building, my understanding is going to be 0. If I'm in a flow state, I'm appropriately caffeinated, appropriately rested, then the trigger will trigger the understanding very easily. So now we understand that triggering the understanding is not based on the book, because the book is static in all scenarios. The state of the human being determines the level of understanding that you get from outside sources. So now if the state of the human being determines it, to what percentage does the state of the human being determine it? Now, a lot of people will think like, is it 50-50? But this is where you can understand things entirely within yourself. There are cases of creativity.
Everything becomes a mirror. Yeah.
There are cases where you can actually develop a truly original idea, right? And if it can happen once, then we get to Ajna Chakra practices. So Ajna Chakra practices are practices which cultivate your connection to that within you which understands. And the more that you cultivate that connection, I kind of view it like a pipeline, like most of us have straws.
Yeah.
But as you do these practices, you cultivate like more and more of a pipeline. And the reason that like our content is successful, this is what's kind of weird. Everyone thinks I'm a good psychiatrist. I mean, I'm a good psychiatrist, I'm sure, but I'm actually not like the best psychiatrist in the world. The reason that I'm so good at interviewing people is because I cheat. And what I do is I rely on my Ajna Chakra to give me insight into other human beings. So it's not even like psychotherapy or anything like that. I'm actually leaning into meditative stuff, which is why I can have a conversation with someone for like 15 minutes and like understand what they need.
Yeah.
But I'm leaning on insight. I'm not leaning on science or psychiatry.
Yeah, rather than have a decision tree flow. If they say this, then we go here. There's a holistic experiencing and then a knowing.
Yeah, and I would say I do both, right? So there are times where I access Vidya and like from scientific outcomes and stuff like that, it would be malpractice to not use those decision trees.
Of course.
And I think on the flip side, all of the truly great therapists and psychiatrists also tap into the knowings. And there's tons of literature about that as well.
Yeah. Wow. Gosh, so much. How do I even begin this? It's wonderful to go to therapy, and that's been my experience. But a good therapist it's not the person who's read the same books as the other person. There is an additional quality of, you call it intuition. I don't know how to pronounce the word that you just said, but and also a relationship that I've seen is very important. So I encourage people to do therapy while understanding that your results may vary wildly depending on your experience of the person that is sitting across from you and the state that you're in when you enter into it. What are practices to widen that flow?
Yeah, so I mean, so we have a guide to meditation where we talk about all this kind of stuff, and I'll teach like a series of Ajna Chakra practices. So I think that like a couple of simple practices. So the first one that you need to do even before you do a meditative practice, which is a cleansing practice, is something called Trataka or fixed point gazing. So candle gazing is really common. Basically, you stare at a candle flame for an extended period of time without blinking. So you'll go without blinking for 3 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. You build yourself up. Yeah. Should be done under the guidance of a teacher. And then there are other kinds of practices that you can do. I'm going to like speed run them here, and you really have to like learn how to do it properly. But so the next practice that I would teach someone is if you close your eyes for a second and you breathe, I want you to notice the breath in your nose. Where do you feel the breath in your nose?
In my sinus.
Okay, so close your eyes. And now I want you to follow, so you can probably detect temperature, right? What does it feel like when you breathe in?
A little bit cooler.
Okay, and point with one finger to where you feel the coolness of the breath in your nose. Okay, now I want you to go a little bit higher and look for the coolness there. Can you feel it sort of towards the top of your nose or bridge of your nose?
Yeah, I can feel it start to sort of climb.
Okay, close your eyes.
I'm cheating.
Okay. So now you said you can feel it climb. How high does it go?
Pretty, yeah, I can feel it all the way up to the top. Yeah.
Which is fucking weird.
Yeah.
Right? So, you know this whole idea of chi or prana, life energy?
Yes.
So does your breath actually travel to the top of your skull?
Not in my understanding.
Absolutely not, right? If it did, you're in big trouble. Like we need to take you to the emergency room right now. If you've got air at the top of your skull, that's a real problem. The other thing is your brain doesn't even have sensory nerve fibers. You can cut into your brain and you won't feel a damn thing.
And yet
you can feel it.
Yes.
So what I would so this is diagnostically like you're in good shape. I can tell.
Shit
I can assess you based on where your awareness is, and I would bet that 90 to 95% of people who end up watching this podcast do not feel it at the top of their head, and you shouldn't try to imagine it. You shouldn't look for it. And so what you want to do is you just want to feel it here. That's the first step, and then you want to. It's going to sound kind of weird. Concentrate your breath into your third eye. And as you concentrate your breath into your third eye, you'll start to feel other things. And then we have another thing, another practice which Twitch and YouTube love called charging the laser beam, where we do something where we like evoke a so I asked
Vision.
chat, not vision. So we did this practice, and I was like, okay,
Vision, the guy with the laser beam here in the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Oh, yeah.
He shoots a laser beam out of his third eye.
So I asked chat, we did this practice, and I was like, what did this practice feel like? And one person was like, it felt like I was charging a laser beam on my forehead. So it literally feels like the accumulation of an energy, like here, and it's just bizarre. But I think it's a really good description of it. But this is the kind of thing where, once again, it's nyan, because if I describe it, like people are gonna be like, what the fuck does that even, no one knows what it feels like. But once you do it, I also detect it. Everyone detects things in a slightly different way. So what I've sort of found is I detect a crumbling sensation that feels like plaster, like falling off of my forehead. And the more that I've like broken away that plaster, the more it sort of feels like the third eye kind of opens up.
That's awesome. It reminds me, gosh, so many things we can talk briefly about before you have to go. And I did want to make sure we've got about 15 minutes now from when you had originally said, but this reminds me of chakras. And we got to talk a little bit about some of the Eastern modalities that are valuable. I have found recently that some understanding of chakras and some reading into it has been profoundly powerful. For me, the value has been that I have focused a lot on heart and wanting to be more loving, but going to the root and addressing, the one at the base of the spine associated with safety is foundational. For at least, not that I couldn't love in any capacity, but for me, that starting the house on, at the bottom floor, because I've done other stuff that has been valuable and I haven't been a complete slouch of a human, but in addressing safety, different possibilities begin to open up. And I'm just curious, that's my experience, but how do you apply, use, teach chakras? Do you teach that sort of stuff?
Yeah, so if we want to talk about chakras, what I'd sort of say is like, instead of trying to do too much, let's do a couple things
less.
and let go of the rest, and we can maybe do it later.
Sure.
So let's understand a couple things about chakras. So chakras are, in my opinion, sort of 100% real and mostly BS at the same time. So a lot of people talk about chakras, but haven't been initiated by like a guru into like tantric Kundalini practice. And so they have vidya, they have this intellectual understanding of it, which doesn't make any sense. So I'd say that 95 to 99% of the crap I read about chakras is sort of informationally correct, but people have no idea what they're talking about. So let's also understand science. There's no scientific evidence of any of this crap. People have been looking for it for a long time. There is right now the best prevailing theory. There's actually a researcher at Harvard who's detected outside of nerves, there are channels in our interstitial space that have a unique conductance. So this is like meridians, like energy lines and all this crap. They're not blood vessels, they're not nerves. But this is the best evidence I've seen, and it's super, super weak, to be honest. So scientifically, this stuff doesn't really exist. From a clinical perspective, now this is where things get interesting. So as a clinician, I can teach meditation, and that can be okay, is because meditation is an evidence-based practice. And we have no science that tells us that teaching someone a chakra-based meditation is superior or inferior to teaching a regular meditation, okay? So as a scientist, as a clinician, I can't teach people practices that there is data that this will be harmful or not helpful. That would be malpractice. But the way that I do it is I actually totally believe in this stuff. I mean, I've done chakra work myself. I think it's really powerful and profound. And I've seen clinical outcomes that are really, really good when I focus on chakras. But it gets kind of complicated. So sort of like from a science standpoint, and I'll even explain this to my patients, it's like I'll say, look, we have tons of evidence that mindfulness is helpful. I'm going to teach you a practice that qualifies as mindfulness. But mindfulness is like 5% of what we know about meditation. I've gone to India and I've learned all this other crap. Are you interested in trying some of this stuff that I believe, based on this non-scientific tradition, could help you? But from a science standpoint, these are the benefits that we can expect based on the studies. Sure. What do you think about this? Do you want to learn a standard practice? Do you want to learn a weird foofy practice? Here are also the safety things that we need to think about, because I do a lot of teaching around harms of meditation, like meditation-induced psychosis and stuff like that. So I don't do like hard or powerful Kundalini practices with patients. Sure. And so then we kind of talk through that, and they're like, okay, fine, let's give it a shot. And so what I find is that based on where someone is in their chakras, those kinds of meditations really help them achieve their goals. So Muladhara chakra you're talking about is the base chakra. That's where you're thinking about safety, but that's also where addictions live. So our base primal needs are like sort of in the Muladhara chakra. So if I'm working with addiction patients, and I even did a very small study of this at McLean Hospital, and presented kind of essentially a pilot, but then started Healthy Gamer, and that all went by the wayside. But even really found like some really cool things. And like all the patients that I worked with, my superiors kind of knew that I was doing this. I was like, hey, I want to teach this meditation stuff. We'll see how it works. They all love it. They started to feel a lot better. They had good outcomes. We don't know that the outcomes were actually any superior to like what standard addiction treatment at McLean is. McLean is like one of the best hospitals in the world. So we don't really know from a data standpoint. And then there's also a decent chance that there's a healthy placebo effect. Right? Because here you've got this guy who studied for 7 years to become a monk, and he's like, at McLean Hospital, which is like the top psychiatric hospital. And we're like at this place, we're at this rehab, and he's got these like secret things that he's going to teach you. Yeah. And the patients are like, yeah, right? Like, let's go. And so even that psychological effect could be responsible, may have nothing to do with the chakras. Yeah. Right? So we have to be sort of clear on the science there and what's responsible for it. All that stuff being said, I think the stuff works. And so when I teach people chakra-oriented practices, I find that they move in the right direction. Placebo could be responsible for it. But Swadhisthana chakra, which is kind of the pubic chakra, for example, is all about relationships. Manipura chakra is our navel chakra, is all about metabolism and digestion. So even if we think about digesting traumas or processing traumas, I'll have people work with Manipura chakra stuff. Heart chakra stuff is all about love and compassion and all that kind of stuff. So we'll do that kind of stuff. Vishuddha chakra stuff, which is your throat chakra, is all about the accumulation of power and achieving things in the outside world. So when I get people who are like managing directors at major investment banks who are like, I want to achieve this thing, or I work with entrepreneurs that are like, I'm going to build this thing and I want to make it real in the universe, I'll teach them like Vishuddha chakra practices. Now, sometimes they need other stuff first. If they're sitting with dramas, we're going to work with that. And then it's the accumulation of power. And then at the top is understanding. So,
and then there's a crown, right?
And then there's a crown, but the crown is completely Advait. So it has no qualities to it.
Awesome.
So, and there's
is there one that's up here too?
No.
Okay.
So there's no practices for the crown chakra.
Okay.
That's like
cool.
can't send energy there.
I like it. That's awesome.
So that's just luck or RNG.
Okay.
You have to do the Buddha thing. So Buddha, right? He was like, F it. I'm going to do all these practices. He got his Kundalini all the way to this chakra, and then nothing was working for the rest of it. He says, screw it. I'm done. And then it rises to the top.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
I love that. All right. Well, we've got about 5-6 minutes. Is that enough time, or we can just pause it for a broad metaphysical overview? Because I really am fascinated by your belief in reincarnation. The chakras, they imply a very different reality than most Westerners have come to know. And the way that you caveated everything that you just said about like, look, I'm responsible to the science. I'm responsible to the placebo effect. I have to be aware of these things. And I also have this experience that leads me to a broader understanding. I'm curious for my own self, what direction I have a tremendous amount of curiosity. And so just knowing a little bit about what you think this thing that we're all doing is or isn't is interesting to me. So I don't know if you have enough time to...
I don't understand what your question is.
Well, okay. So are we all there's like a fixed number of individual souls reincarnating through various bodies at some level? We're all one at some level?
So like what is the fundamental nature of reality?
Yeah, it's a big question.
We can do it in 5 minutes. So let's understand a couple of things. So let's start with science. So I believe that science this has already started to happen. Science has started validating certain Eastern concepts. So meditation is a good example, right? So people have been meditating for thousands of years. Now, the really cool thing about psychedelics is experienced meditators have been shattering their egos and being like reborn into like healthier, less suffering beings. This has been going on for thousands of years. Now we know through brain studies and stuff like that this deactivates the default mode network. This is what kind of destroys. So the deactivation of the default mode network is the neuroscientific correlate of the subjective experience of breaking down the self and being connected to the universe. There's also really weird scientific studies that we've got, which are super cool, which is one study, I think on DMT, found that 94% of people who use DMT report contact with otherworldly beings. Now, this becomes kind of weird because what does this mean? Does this mean that they exist? So I think that DMT could be the next telescope. So if you kind of think about a telescope, you look up into the night sky and 8 billion people on the planet won't see anything. And then I look into a telescope and I see something that 8 billion people cannot see. But anyone who looks through the telescope can verify that experience. So I think psychedelics are really interesting because they may be the avenue through which we understand or detect other kinds of things. So what is the nature of reality? We're not sure. There's also a lot of, I would honestly, like quantum mysticism is a really, really big field where people will like write books about the quantum nature of reality and consciousness. And I think honestly, a lot of that stuff is BS because they don't really understand quantum mechanics. I think a lot of that stuff is like interesting, but I'm sort of like science, mind, brain, right? So what we do know is that there are subjective experiences which are shared amongst human beings of things that transcend our scientific understanding. I know that was like a heavy sentence, but
yeah. Well, I think what you're saying that has been the thread throughout this is, which I love, is that you do not discount the subjective in your external objective, which is not the right word, verification and attention to the placebo effect and curiosity of other people. Can this be replicated? And I think that's so missing in so much of treatment. It's awesome.
And that's because in psychiatry, we have no objective evidence of the mind. I don't think we do anyway.
Yeah, which is often forgot.
So like we have neuroscientific correlates of the mind. So we know that you can get limbic activation, which correlates with the subjective experience of emotion.
But the idea that you're a conscious being is, I have to take your word for it.
I mean, we've been looking for consciousness in the brain and we haven't been able to find it. So does that mean that consciousness is unreal? Well, like each of us experiences it.
Yeah.
So I think this is the way that I sort of understand it. So if you think about like, let's say a sheet that's drying in the wind, our eyes are able to detect the sheet. But if a breeze blows past, we can't see the breeze, but we can see the physical correlate of a breeze. So right now, if we look at neuroscience, it is the physical correlate of subjective experience. But which one is real? This is when we get into philosophy. So I don't think that the physical world is the only form of reality that exists. It is just the one that is the most verifiable, that we're kind of the best at. Right? So even, for example, if you look at energy, energy cannot be seen. It can be detected. We can extrapolate it, right? So we can clearly see a wave moving through water. But if I biopsy the water molecule, I will never find energy, right? It's just a fundamental different kind of thing. It exists, and we can measure it in a lot of ways and stuff like that. But it's kind of like, it's weird. They're like different layers of reality is the best way that I would put it. And if there are physicists out there that are like, we can detect energy in a lot of different, we can detect it, but that doesn't mean that it has physical form. It's not tangible. That's what I mean to say. Energy is not tangible, but it exists. So now if you look at the yogis, they say, here's the nature of the universe. The most fundamental thing is actually something that they call cosmic consciousness or Brahman. And cosmic consciousness coalesces into energy, and energy coalesces into matter. So it's really fascinating because even in texts that are thousands of years old, they'll say in a small amount of matter is an exponential amount of energy.
E equals mc squared.
E equals mc squared. And now we're getting into quantum mysticism.
Not precise, but it's
and
still
they also say something else, which is that in there's E equals MC squared, and there's something else which is like C, or like capital C, consciousness equals E something squared. So in a small amount of energy is a exponential amount of consciousness. Now, from the world of physics, what the fuck does that mean? I have no idea, right? So I don't think science has gotten that far.
Yeah.
And this is where I think a lot of the quantum mystics will make interpretations. So they'll say that, for example, if you look at things like the observer effect, that consciousness actually causes... So reality exists as a probability waveform, and when there is an observation, and this is where people get confused about the physics term of observation, because I don't think it means consciousness, that we collapse a probability waveform into a reality.
Because it needs to be interacted with. And
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's where like people don't understand fundamental physics when they're gurus. And so but that's kind of the nature of reality according to that stuff. Now, this is also where there's like disagreements. Okay, so like what is a soul? So the idea is that we have this cosmic pool of consciousness, and a drop of that consciousness goes and inhabits a body. So it's a drop of consciousness that has a physical body, has a mental body, has like a form. And then when the body disappears, that the drop of consciousness can move on. Now, this sounds super fancy, but I don't think it's like actually that fancy. And there's also disagreement between Hindus and Buddhists. So what Buddhists say is that there's matter, there's energy, and there's consciousness. And what we'd say simply what consciousness is subjective experience. So you experience stuff. That's not an energy waveform, and it's not a physical thing. But you like taste, and you feel, and you like, and you dislike. There's a you there, right? And we know that neither matter nor energy can be destroyed. So when your body breaks down, you turn into mushrooms turn into whatever, and that eventually will be another human being. We're stardust. We know that that's scientifically true. In the same way, energy cannot be created or destroyed. So the energy of your metabolism, the kinetic energy that you have, you can transfer that kinetic energy into building a bench, right? And then there's like some energy stored in there.
And implied in that is that my memories are not merely stored in the collection of neurons in my brain, but there might be some potential consciousness mechanism by which they would survive my body.
Hold on, we'll get to that. So the Buddhists believe that in the same way that we can shatter your body into 1,000 pieces and it will no longer have the identity of your body, we can shatter your energy into 1,000 pieces and it will no longer have the identity of your energy. I mean, like physics-wise, okay? Like mitochondria level. We can shatter your consciousness into 1,000 different pieces and it will no longer be your consciousness. That as your conscious being interacts with the world, I don't know if this kind of makes sense, but if you give me a hug, you will create a conscious experience for me. So in that same way, like and so it's not that your consciousness stays yours in the same way that matter can be shattered. So as you go through life, you are going to create conscious experiences for like thousands of other human beings. And then you'll die, and then you will linger in their consciousness in some way. And this is also where karma comes in, where like karma governs physical stuff, right? If I break something in two, it's two pieces. Karma governs energy. If I lift a bottle up in the air, I've now created potential energy that can then be harnessed. And even on the conscious level, the words that I do or say will affect other conscious beings in other ways. Yeah. But the Buddhists, I don't think, believe that you carry your memories with your soul from one life to the
Understood.
next.
But and if I think I get it.
The Hindus believe that you carry something with you. Who knows what's real?
Cool. Well, I could ask tons of questions, but you've got to get a plane. Thank you so much for making it out here. It's been awesome. Where should people go to find you? You mentioned, and I also want to call out, you mentioned that you have a coaching thing and a course that has a number of the topics that we've talked about in greater detail.
So we have a YouTube channel that's Healthy Gamer GG. We have a website that's www.healthygamer.gg. If people are interested, especially because we talked about like the metaphysics and stuff today. So we have a couple of things called Dr. K's Guide to Mental Health. We have one on depression, one on anxiety, one on ADHD, and one on meditation. But those are things that are not just the clinical stuff. So we explain clinical stuff, but we also explain this kind of experiential stuff. So in the Guide to Depression, we explain, okay, there's like a clinical illness, but sometimes when people are depressed, they're not ill, they're unhappy. And I've even worked with patients where they'll come into my office and they'll say like, hey, like I'm not depressed, but I still feel depressed. And I'm like, bro, you're not depressed anymore. You're just unhappy. And so we kind of talk about a lot of this stuff, even like the nature of knowledge and metaphysics is in our meditation guide. And we'll also teach like series of practices for each of those conditions. So practices for anxiety, practices for ADHD, practices for like spiritual development. And then we also have a coaching program, but that's kind of like divorced from a lot of this stuff. So we'll help people do things like find purpose. There's good data behind our programs.
Beautiful.
We just presented our findings at the American Psychiatric Association, just about helping people find purpose in life. And what we sort of find is that when they find purpose, depression and anxiety get better. But we don't treat depression or anxiety. We help people like build a life that like sort of builds resilience, and then the mental stuff gets better.
Cool. So if you guys want to check that out, you know where to go. Thank you so much for making
Charlie.
it out here. It's been awesome.
I can't wait till round 2.
Yes, gosh, we got to do it. I have so many more questions. Thank you.
Okay, take care, man. Bye.
Beautiful.